morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Shujoy Prasad Chatterjee, an interdisciplinary artist from Kolkata, joining you on the third and the final day of Arth, a culture fest. As a performing artist, I'm often haunted by two questions. Whose India is it anyway? Whose idea of India is it anyway? Is it ours? Is it yours? Is it a given? Is it a digital? Is it Atmanirbhar? Well, the questions are too many and the divide is too many too, but I guess the unity lies in that diversity that leads us to the quest of revisiting, re-exploring, reconnecting, rediscovering ourselves through this 3-day culture fest, through riveting discussions, live performances right on your screen. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start the first panel of this morning, I'd like to thank our partners, channel partners, Zee News, Zee Hindustan, Zee TV and TV, Zee Marathi, Zee Bangla, Zee Punjabi, Zee Ganga, Zee Bioscope, Zee Yuva, Zee Anmol Cinema, Zee Classic, Zee Cinema HD, and Pictures HD, Zing, Zee Fest, Zee Zest, Zee Cafe, and Priv HD and Explore HD. Culture partner, Incredible India. Radio partner, Red FM. Cine movie partner, UFO Movies. Transit partner, Cash Your Drive. Gifting partner, Biogi. College outreach partner, Half Ticket Entertainment. Publishing partner, HarperCollins India and Penguin Random House. Entertainment partners, Zplex. Digital outreach partners, IMS Ghaziabad. History of Modern India. WhatsApp Live. India Lost and Found. Pen of Dharma. Community partners, Maitri Ray Associates, and community partner, Lions Club. We move on to the first panel of today, which is also my question. Whose idea of India is it anyway? Joining us is a panel of eminent panelists. Shashi Tharoor, to begin with, it's a delight and honor to introduce you, sir. Shashi Tharoor is a renowned author, politician, and former international civil servant. Presently, he's serving as Lok Sabha MP and represents the Thiruvananthapuram constituency, and is also appointed as a chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Shashi Tharoor joining us on this panel. We have with us Baijayant Panda, who's the National Vice President of the Bharatiya Janata Party and Prabhari in charge of Assam and Delhi BJP units. He's the author of the book Luton's Maverick, Ground Realities, Hard Choices, and Tomorrow's India. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute delight and honor to invite Baijayant Panda on stage with us. Thank you. I'd like to also introduce, and it's an honor to introduce the moderator for this panel, Aarti Tikoo, who's a New Delhi-based journalist. She's been a writer, analyst, editor for the last 2 decades, covering a wide range of issues. Ladies and gentlemen, Aarti Tikoo in conversation with Shashi Tharoor and Baijayant Panda, discussing whose idea of India is it anyway, only exclusively at Arth, a culture fest.
Good morning, Dr. Tharoor. Good morning, Mr. Panda. It's an honor and privilege to be hosting and moderating this session with the two biggest intellectual giants of Indian politics. It's also a privilege to be here on the 75th year of independence of India. And I must begin this conversation with a question to Dr. Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor, we often hear from the opposition that the India that they knew or the India that they grew up in is falling apart under the current dispensation. Whose idea of India and what idea of India are they referring to when they make such claims?
It's very simple, Aarti. It's the idea of India enshrined in the Constitution. That emerged obviously from the freedom struggle, but there were giants of the nationalist movement who contributed to the discussion, not only from one party. Indeed, Dr. Ambedkar, Shyam Mukherjee, Rajendra Prasad, a wide range of voices were heard on various questions. And of course, Dr. Ambedkar chaired the drafting committee that produced the Constitution. And that Constitution left Indians in no doubt that what had been created was an inclusive India, a country where citizenship would be amongst equals, where it wouldn't matter what your religion was, your caste was, your region of birth, your language at home. None of these considerations would impede your rights and your opportunities in India, because India would not be an ethnic democracy. It would instead be a country built on institutions and a constitution. And that is the idea of India that we've always celebrated, one which therefore recognizes and embraces our diversity as a given of life and something to be joyful about. Whereas unfortunately, the one political tendency in post-independent India that never accepted the basic underpinnings of this idea of India was indeed those who argued that India should be a Hindu Rashtra. They said so at the time that the constitution was adopted, and they rejected it at that time. And their political legatees, who have been initially the Bharatiya Janata Sangh and subsequently the Bharatiya Janata Party, have continued to hold on to this idea of Hindutva as their ruling ideology, reducing this vast, diverse, and inclusive idea of India into something much more exclusionary and limited to the dominance of one community in India, the Hindu community. A Hindu Rashtra is their vision. And the result of that, unfortunately, is that they seem to be shaping India more and more towards becoming a Hindu version of Pakistan, which was never the idea in the constitution, never the idea of the founding fathers and mothers of our country, and not the idea at all that animated the freedom struggle.
Mr. Panda, would you agree that India today in 21st century under Prime Minister Narendra Modi is not inclusive and is heading towards becoming a Hindu Rashtra?
I don't agree with what Shashi Tharoor has said, although he has said it very eloquently. And it is the narrative that has dominated Indian media and academia for more than 70 years. It sounds very nice, but allow me the chance to expose the holes in that argument and how that has frayed in these decades. The so-called idea of India has as one of its fundamental components secularism. But this is a secularism that was imposed on India, not the traditional ancient Indian secularism which welcomed all beliefs, all faiths, allowed the Parsis to have sanctuary here and many, many others. But this is the secularism of 19th century colonial rulers, which had a peculiar inversion. In this secularism, only the places of worship of the Hindus are controlled by government. Now, any place of worship being controlled by government can not be called secularism. You try saying this is secularism to the Americans or the British or the Australians or the Germans, they will laugh at your face. No other places of worship in India are controlled by the government. Now, this twist on the word secularism has been carried forward by the Brown Sahibs that extend that same idea of India. So this fundamental idea, the fundamental component of the idea of India is flawed itself. Now, Shashi talks about the constitution. He talks about the Hindu Rashtra that some people want. You know, the beauty of our constitution is it allows anybody to want anything. But if, you know, to live in India legitimately, legally, you have to abide by the constitution. The BJP is committed to the constitution. Let me point out, many of Shashi's own followers and voters believe in the idea of Sharia. Now, they may be entitled to believe in that idea of Sharia, but are they entitled to impose that on India? No. So when we say that we believe in the constitution, we also believe in the directive principles of the constitution, such as the Uniform Civil Code. Now, in a modern democracy, every individual has the same rights, and every Indian, irrespective of gender, religion, caste, creed, has the same rights. But Shashi and his cohort who put forward and extend this Britishers' idea of India don't want a uniform civil code. They did not bring about triple talaq reform for the many decades that they were in power. So they believe in group rights rather than individual rights. That belongs, 5 centuries ago in something like the Ottoman Empire. It doesn't belong in the greatest, largest democracy that the world has ever seen, where every citizen is equal.
Dr. Tharoor, what Mr. Panda is really alluding to is that the Congress Party, or the idea of the Congress Party, has been appeasement of Muslims in this country. Is that correct? Has the Congress played its own communal politics over the idea of India in the last 75 years?
First of all, let me, if I may, react to what Jay said, because you will notice that he refuted 3 terms that I had never used. You can win any debate by redefining its terms. So he used secular, he used Sharia, he used group rights, and none of those are things that I've actually said in my opening remarks, as the audience well knows. So Jay has his own straw men that he would like to attack, and I congratulate him for it, but those are not the issues. I spoke about diversity, I spoke about pluralism, I spoke about individual rights, because in fact, as I've written extensively in the last couple of years, and I'm working on a book on this, one of the great contributions of the Constitution was the actual giving of agency to the individual Indian citizen for the first time. Because in fact, it was the British who had communal electorates, and the Congress eloquently objected to the idea, saying that we will not let people be defined by their religion. In the British days, only Muslims could vote for Muslim candidates and so on. And we said, nothing doing. Everybody is an equal citizen. Everybody will find their political destiny, will develop their political agency as individual citizens. That's been my argument for many years, and it's something that Ajay cannot now convert into somebody else's argument, not mine. Now, coming back to your question, Aarti, I mean, I think you've raised an important issue of the question of, if you could tell your sound people there is a massive echo coming back. Very difficult to hear myself think with my own words echoing back at me. Thanks. So as you were saying, Aarti, is the Congress Party guilty of appeasing Muslims? Now, the fact is that this is again a popular canard that the BJP has been flinging at the Congress for quite some time. If indeed the Congress Party had spent the bulk of 70 years appeasing the Muslim community, one would really have to ask why that community is amongst the poorest and most deprived and most marginalized in our society, which is underrepresented in the administrative services, the police and the military, and overrepresented in the prisons. I mean, clearly, if at all there was any appeasement, it hasn't worked very well. And I don't particularly believe in these terms of appeasement when it comes to dealing with people in our own society. It's a job of every government to ensure that as many benefits as possible are extended to the weakest elements of our society.
Let me interrupt you here. Is that an admission that the Congress Party has actually marginalized Muslims, even though they played the appeasement politics or the rhetoric, but on the ground, Muslims have been discriminated against?
No, Aarti, I think partition is what the biggest blow to the Muslim community in India was partition, because partition essentially produced a very lopsided remnant here. If you look at Hindus, if you look at pretty much any other community, you have more or less a consistent pattern of how many in the elite, how many in the upper middle class, how many in the professional middle classes, how many in the lower middle classes, how many poor. Pretty much every community is about the same. The only exception is the Muslim community, because their middle class, upper middle class, and a good chunk of their elite essentially went to Pakistan. And suddenly they were left as a disproportionately poor, unlettered, marginalized community. This is a reality the BJP doesn't like to confront, but it is true. It is a legacy of 47. There were certainly some elites, no question, of some zamindars with too much land and therefore couldn't leave India, as well as some others who were succeeding, those who were ideologically convinced that pluralist India was the right place and not a religion-based Pakistan. But the vast majority of the ordinary people who were left behind were the ones who were too poor to have a viable or successful life. Now, where some projects, programs, and subsidies may have been allotted, and there weren't very many, and as I pointed out, there still weren't enough to change this reality, you can abuse it with terms like appeasement. But the actual fact is, this is an unusually poor community and an unusually sidelined community by the standards of every other community in our country. Every community has poor people. There are poor Hindus. But the fact also is that in the case of
Mr.
the
Panda
Muslims,
wants
a
to
lot of the
add in.
elite. Yeah.
Let me respond very quickly. Now, Shashi accuses me of a straw man argument on secularism, on individual rights. The reality is that Shashi and his colleagues continually espouse this so-called idea of India, and that inherently includes the definition of secularism that I have said. So if Shashi says he doesn't subscribe to that, that's wonderful. I want Shashi to come out and openly say that the so-called Indian secularism is inverted.
He wrote a book on
right.
why
I know. But he said I was
Hindu.
putting words in his mouth. So that's wonderful. Now, secondly, Shashi said that he didn't refer to the why they didn't reform triple talaq in all these decades at all. He didn't refer to he talks about individual rights.
Or Shahbano.
Or Shahbano. So when, he talks about individual rights, but when I point out that there is an unfinished part of the Constitution, the directive principle of implementing the Uniform Civil Code, which grants individual rights equally to all citizens, he just avoided that question. So, but I'll leave that be. I'll move on to something else. He talked about the Congress opposing the communal constituencies of being advocated by the Muslim League. That was pre-partition, and the Congress changed dramatically after that. Let me tell you how else the Congress has changed dramatically. By carrying forward this Brown Sahib mentality, you saw recently, for instance, that when 7 years ago, Prime Minister Narendra Modi advocated an International Yoga Day, which ultimately got accepted by the UN, and it's now a global phenomenon. Many of Shashi's colleagues made fun of it and said that this is the so-called Hinduization of Indian government. And yet, back in the 50s, the first Prime Minister of India used to publicly participate in yoga. So the Congress of today is very different from the Congress of the 1940s, and many decades of dynastic politics have completely taken it out of touch with the Indian public, and where the Congress today marginalized. It's barely there in 3 or 4 states. And the reality is, it is completely out of touch with aspirational India, which cuts across every section of society, every religion, every caste. And you can see that the Congress has failed them, and they don't have much truck with it anymore.
I think really will have to chip in here, because Jay is clearly debating the wrong person. Not only did I welcome International Day of Yoga, but I actually situated it in I have been arguing for 25 years is our greatest strength, and that India and every Indian government needs to do more to enhance and promote our soft power. And I said, this is a very good example of promoting soft power, but the same BJP government, sadly, has undermined our soft power by attacking the diversity, pluralism, and democratic ferment that the rest of the world actually finds attractive. I mean, I was not in the Congress party. I was not even in Indian politics when the 2004 election results came out. I haven't been traveling in the Arab world for the United Nations. And when I heard all the time from
Tharoor, let me interrupt.
Utter astonishment at the fact that we had an election won by a party led by a Roman Catholic woman of Italian origin who made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president in a country 80% Hindu. Their admiration told me the kind of soft power that we get around the world just by being us. That's my point, that what they're trying to change about the idea of India takes us away from what we naturally are,
Tharoor,
and undermines our appeal around the world.
Tharoor, why do we always look for the Western validation? Why is it that we need the certificate from the Western world or the Eastern world that we are doing right things in this country? Is it?
No, we don't.
My question is that when you say that you are a Hindu, when you actually write a book on why you are a Hindu, you are celebrating Hinduism almost on the same lines as the Veer Savarkar school would. But at the same time, you're saying that this government, this particular government, has undermined the ethos, the philosophy of that Hindu culture or Hindu idea of India.
Okay, so now you're getting me on 2 different tangents. First, you say, why do we need foreign validation? I didn't say we need it. Jay was making a virtue of the fact that we went to the United Nations and got the Day of Yoga adopted. Indeed, Nehruji never found it necessary to do that. He stood on his head every day for most of his life. I mean, he was an outstanding practitioner of yoga. He never sought any foreign validation for it. So I'm just responding to Jay on that. But when you talk about other things, I mean, let's face it, my book, Why I'm a Hindu, was indeed an intervention in the national political conversation because I wanted to explain that for me and millions like me, Hinduism is not what the Hindutvavadis have tried to make of it. That Hinduism that I knew and grew up with, and by the way, lots of people from all political spectrums who read the book came to me at various times and said, we read this with a sense of recognition that indeed what you've described is the Hinduism that most of us in India know. It is not the Hinduism the Hindutva movement has been creating, which is much more akin to the hooliganism of the sort of British football lout who goes around saying that if you're not in my team, you're not supporting my team, I'll hit you on the head. That is not Hinduism. That is simply not what our understanding, what Swami Vivekananda preached, what every single serious scholar of Hinduism has talked about. That is not the Hinduism of the Hindutva movement. You mentioned Mr. Savarkar. Mr. Savarkar was not particularly fond of Hinduism as a religion. He saw it in terms of cultural identity. And cultural nationalism is indeed what his legatees in the BJP and their political ideas are all about. So let me just say that what was essentially my argument about the idea of India is not even about the question of Hindu. I would love people to feel free to be Hindu, but I would also like them to be free to be Muslim, to be Christian, to be Jewish, to be atheist if they want, because India and the Indian Constitution grants everyone the same rights.
Mr. Panda, I want to bring in Savarkar here because there is a school of thought which believes that cultural Hinduism, or the idea that India is a geographical and cultural, multicultural nation, at the base of which is Indic civilization, at the base of which is Hinduism, which has been defined by even the Supreme Court as a way of life rather than religion in the Western sense. Would you agree with that? And would you agree with Shashi about, what he said on Hinduism and hooliganism that this particular government has created out of Hinduism?
Let me respond. You gave him a very long rope, and I think it deserves a proper response. So I'm glad that Shashi agrees with me that the secularism definition is wrong. Most of his colleagues don't, but it's good. I'm glad that he agrees on individual rights. I urge him to put his money where his mouth is, and when the Uniform Civil Code discussion comes up in Parliament, to actually vote for it. Now, he said that Nehruji didn't go to the UN on Yoga Day, and that was a good thing. I disagree. I think taking Indian soft power abroad and making it an established Yoga Day around the world is important. Sadly, Nehruji went to the UN on the wrong topics, such as Kashmir, and we are still suffering from that. Now, finally, Shashi keeps talking about this discrimination, that the so-called discrimination under the BJP. Now, our governing slogan is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, Sabka Prayas. Now, I challenge Shashi on something. We've had more than 7 years of the Modi government. We've had a dramatic turnaround of governance in terms of drinking water now having gone to tens of millions of households, piped drinking water, and every Indian household will have drinking water within the next 3 years. Similarly, electricity going to every last home, not just every last village. The massive cutting of corruption by direct benefit transfer. Literally many tens of billions of dollars have been saved. Now, I challenge Shashi to show me examples of discrimination in these government programs. I challenge Shashi to show me, either in his home state of Kerala, or mine in Odisha, or in the Northeast, or anywhere in the country, that when drinking water projects are implemented, does it exclude Muslims? Does it exclude people of certain castes? It doesn't. The reality is, when he talked about marginalized communities, such as Muslims, for instance, or such as underprivileged people that had been neglected by the state for many centuries, the reality is that they were used politically. They were ghettoized in the name of standing up for them. Political leaders from their own community, and certainly of the party that Shashi has been a member of for the last decade, utilized them, used them, never saw them progress. So when Prime Minister Modi led the charge to bring about these reforms. You know, Nehruji started these social reforms with Hindu personal law and then stopped short. He didn't go forward. Now, today, to take this reform forward, we must have a uniform civil code. Millions of Muslim women have been discriminated against and held back. And I'm sure Shashi will agree with me, although his people, his party people, his colleagues, the adherents of this so-called idea of India, they didn't, and they didn't support it.
Okay,
Dr.
again, I
Tharoor,
do-
before you respond to statements, I would like to ask another question. There's a view that the Congress's idea of India was the post-colonial, English-speaking elite idea of India. Now that 7 years ago, when Prime Minister Modi came to power, it seems that the unwashed masses, the poor, the people who look up to him and who relate to him and who actually celebrate the idea that a chaiwala has become the Prime Minister of India. Does the Congress somewhere represent only the English-speaking elite of India? And does the Congress believe in the idea of India where only the elites can be accommodated?
No, obviously not. I mean, that is, to be honest, such a what a question you asked. Would any party, even if they did, would they go around saying, yeah, we're only there for the elites? First of all, that's not the Congress's tradition. The Congress was a socialist party. It believed very much in the egalitarian ideals of the freedom struggle. And what is more, it consistently made a virtue of them. So to my mind, the notion that the Congress is in any way a party of the elites strikes me as cynical in the extreme. Jay essentially credits me with disavowing secularism. I've not disavowed secularism. I have simply said, not in today's debates, but elsewhere, that I prefer the word pluralism and diversity because that's what we're here to celebrate. But that even if the word secularism had not been inserted into the Constitution in 1976, the Constitution of India is a secular constitution because it grants everybody equal rights irrespective of religion and at the same time allows them to practice and propagate their own religion as they wish. So it's a constitution which, to my mind, gives everyone the right to be who they want to be. Now, when it comes to things like drinking water and direct benefits transfer, both of which were projects initiated by Congress governments and both of which I believe are necessary to carry on any government that comes to power. In the case of the 90s, we had 4 different prime ministers and they essentially continued the policies of the government of the past. To make a virtue of that now, I think is a bit embarrassing because we are not talking about whether Muslims are getting drinking water or cooking gas. I'm sure that every citizen is getting it equally to the extent they're getting it, because we also know that many can't afford refills of cooking gas, that many of the toilets built in the villages don't have running water. So slogans are one thing, implementation is another, but that's a different conversation. Having said that, the fact still remains that there is only one community being demonized on a daily basis by the ruling party and its leaders. There is only one community which actually has even its places of burial being mentioned politically in the so-called Kabristan political rhetoric, Smashan Ghat and Kabristan. You're also seeing, unfortunately now, the current hijab controversy, which is an exercise in othering just one particular group of schoolgirls by the very ruling party that's supposed to have given us the slogan, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. And you're actually in the process of denying them access to their educational institutions because of a trivial garment that most of us have lived with and not objected to for decades. So clearly there is a certain exercise in differentiation that the ruling party is pushing, and that differentiation is an exercise, an active exercise in othering. I'm not saying that Jay personally has shared any of those biases, but he's speaking for a party that does.
I'm going to let Mr. Panda respond to this.
Well, I'm glad that Shashi agrees that there has been no discrimination in the implementation of these government programs. Regarding secularism, I'm glad at what he has said. I only say that almost all the other people who claim to be adherents of this so-called idea of India, they agree with the existing definition of secularism, which controls Hindu temples and any control of any religious place of worship is not secularism. Now, Shashi talked about...
I didn't
Shashi
get a
talked
chance
about,
to
let me,
respond.
let me come. Shashi, you've had a,
Civil code.
let me,
No, on the civil
let me
code
just
that
say.
you asked me to.
So Shashi spoke at length about the so-called demonization of a minority community. That's not the case. He earlier spoke about this being an Indian Pakistan. It's not the case. Let me say why. Because unlike Pakistan, which for 7 decades has seen the decimation of minorities, Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists have been decimated, and they've fled to India or been killed or forcibly converted in Pakistan. You don't see that in India. No minority people are fleeing from India. Neither in the, since the partition, nobody has fled India. And it's not happening now. Now, when triple talaq reform was brought in, many of Shashi's colleagues said exactly the same thing, that you're demonizing them, you're harassing a community. Now, that's not true. This is true secularism, when you treat every woman, whether she is Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, to have the same rights. And that's why I keep coming back with uniform civil rights, uniform civil code. Now, he's brought up this recent hijab debate. Now, since it's in court, I won't speak conclusively on it, but I do want to cite a very famous Indian politician, former politician, is Arif Muhammad Khan, who's today the governor of his home state. Now, I think India took a turn for the worse when Arif Muhammad Khan was betrayed by the Congress Prime Minister in the mid-1980s, when reform of personal code of Islamic law was held up and reversed by the government after the Supreme Court had held that every Muslim woman would be equal. Now, what has Arif Muhammad Khan said today? He has said, yes, indeed, everybody has the right to whatever clothing they wish to wear. But if they are going to an institution, if you go to the army, if you go to the police, if you go to certain institution and they have certain institutional rules, you should obey the code of that institutional rules. Now, this will finally be decided upon by the courts, so I don't want to say anything further. But to cite this as demonization is terribly wrong on Shashi's part.
Dr. Tharoor, triple talaq, hijab, all these issues, are they really demonization of Muslims in India?
Yeah, let me explain. And also on the Uniform Civil Code, I didn't get to it when you folks cut me off last time. So on the Uniform Civil Code, I do want to remind you that even Jawaharlal Nehru pronounced himself in favor of it, but he said, especially given his experience with the resistance to the Hindu Code Bill, that it was going to be important to bring communities along. And therefore, I think a serious move towards a Uniform Civil Code will have to embrace extensive consultations with all stakeholders, and therefore practitioners of other faiths. Therefore, it should not be something that is done merely by a bunch of bureaucrats sitting in the law ministry. There has to be a process of consultation. We are a democracy, and we can recognize a desirable goal, but we can also recognize the very valid reasons why it may not be easy to get there. Now, let's turn to what you said, because I happen to be a reasonably good friend of Arif Muhammad Khan. We see each other quite frequently because he happens to live in my constituency as the governor of Kerala. He lives in the capital city that I represent in Parliament. And we've discussed this very issue. I mean, and his argument is, for example, that as far as the Uniform Civil Code is concerned, he says there are certain questions of rights and outcomes that should be equal for all people, but there are cultural practices which will naturally differ. He said, which law is going to prevent a Muslim from giving meher to his wife? And that's precisely a logical response, that you must have allowances in our diversity for diverse cultural practices. And when the BJP that Mr. Panda speaks for, speaks of cultural nationalism, they are trying to assimilate all of India's many cultures into a very Hindu idea, and some would even argue very Brahminical Hindu idea of what is the culture of this country. I think an idea of culture that embraces diversity.
Let me interrupt you here.
Is much easier to agree on than that. And on the hijab controversy, by the way, the only point to be made about whether in the army you can wear a hijab or not is that will, as Jay said, depend on the decisions the courts will make. But let's not forget that our Sikh brothers are able to wear turbans in the army and in the police, and have even been exempted from helmets in some jurisdictions. So the fact is that you do make allowances for the cultural practices of a particular religious group. And it may be that the courts will make the same allowance for the cultural practices of our Muslim sisters. I leave it there.
Tharoor, let me ask this question. Why do you constantly say that Hindutva is a very regressive idea of India, when the Supreme Court itself said that Hindutva is just a way of life where you celebrate, you tolerate, and in fact, assimilate and live together, coexist together with each other. It's a way of life. Second question, that Hindutva itself, or Hinduism itself, is quite heterogeneous. It's not monolithic. It's quite diverse itself. So why do you cage the word Hindutva in such limited, narrow definition?
I think quite simply, it was defined by the man who came up with the term, though there is some dispute over somebody else had thought of it earlier in the 1890s. The one who made it famous by writing the book, The Essentials of Hindutva, was indeed V.D. Savarkar. And his definition was very clear that Hindutva is a political project and not a religious identity. He said that Hinduism is only a small part of Hindutva from his point of view. And whereas Hinduism is indeed in many ways a way of life, and indeed Dr. Radhakrishnan, in his famous series of lectures at Oxford, actually spoke of the Hindu way of life, Hindutva has a very specific political project, which is why it was adopted by the BJP in the late 1980s as its governing political ideology. It has nothing really to do with religion. It is an aspect of cultural identity and a political project to be pursued by the ruling party. Now, they have every right to pursue their political project, but I think the conflation with Hinduism is indeed unfortunate and, in many people's minds, confusing. I have tried to make that distinction clear in my book. I consider myself a sort of very proud Hindu, but I do not consider myself an adherent of the political project of Hindutva. And there are many others in the same boat. And there are some who are, I would say, cynically advocating Hindutva who are not Hindu at all. So that's a different argument. But I would say to you very simply, Aarti, that my concern about the Hindutva project is that it's a political one and is really not anchored in the essential elements of the spiritual, philosophical, and thought ethos of Hinduism or of Hindu civilization.
Do you agree that Savarkar's definition of Hindutva was regressive, it was very narrow, and a political project?
No, Savarkar's definition of Hinduism and Hindutva was not narrow at all. It was far, far more inclusive than Shashi gives it credit for. And even if we accept Shashi's interpretation, that it is a cultural interpretation, cultural nationalism, I don't see anything wrong with that, because that clearly seems to indicate that people can be of any faith, but India has an overwhelming culture which has an overwhelming Hindu element to it, which does recognize other subcultures as well. It is not to amalgamate them into one, but to represent an Indian national understanding. I don't think there is anything wrong in that at all. Now, I just want to say a couple of other things. Now, Shashi seems to be saying many things that most of his colleagues and most of adherents of the so-called idea of India don't agree with, whether it comes to uniform civil code, triple talaq, definition of secularism, and so on and so forth. He talks about the so-called discrimination, and as I said, and as he admitted, there is no discrimination in the government programs. Now, the reality is that when he said, when he keeps insisting that there is this deliberate design to suppress other cultures or other religions, this is part of that idea of India Brigade, which have spun this narrative, and they have tried to rewrite and twist history. So it's a leftist narrative, and sadly his party, which used to be somewhat centrist 70, 80 years ago, became center-left, has today gone to the far left and is has officially identified with jihadi parties in several states, including Shashi's own state. Now, that cohort, that brigade, if you read the twisting of history that they have done in the last 70 years, you would imagine that India barely had any history before the last few hundred years. And you know, the glorification of one set of history and the complete, you know, you'd be hard-pressed to find much about Emperor Ashoka in Indian school history books, let alone Kalinga, or let alone Kharavela, one of the great kings who then took revenge on the Magadha Empire from from Kalinga. Now, or Vijayanagar, or many other examples. So I would sum up by saying that that narrative has been spun to death. The reality is something quite different. I'd urge your viewers to dig deeper into these topics.
Now we're going to open the floor for questions. The first question from our audience is, can there be any idea of India beyond the book of Constitution? Dr. Tharoor.
Now, as I said, no, I think that the idea of India is the idea of India enshrined in the Constitution. And therefore, I challenge Jay and the party he speaks for as to why they are indeed undermining the very Constitution that the Prime Minister hailed as his holy book.
I would urge Shashi to take a look at our party's constitution, the BJP's constitution, which is clearly committed to the Indian constitution. And I want to put an example. You know, a couple of years ago, when Article 370 was abrogated, there was a hue and cry from, again, many of the same brigade who argue that there is a majoritarianism, who argue that there is a crushing of dissent. There is all these arguments about Hindutva, about secularism being in danger. The reality is that Article 370 was the only temporary article in the Constitution. They had 7 decades to withdraw it. They didn't do it. Just like when he says that a lot of consultation is required for Uniform Civil Code, but you've had 7 decades of consultations. How much do you want? Now, the Article 370 allowed a lot of injustice to happen in Jammu and Kashmir, such as suppression of women's rights, suppression of LGBTQ rights, suppression of Dalit rights. So it's you know,
You're essentially saying that it was ratified, this whole Article 370's nullification was ratified by Parliament, so it is constitutional.
My point
and
exactly. And my point is that we are committed to the Constitution. We are acting as per the Constitution. Now, if you feel otherwise, you've raised some challenges in the court. Let's see what they say. But the reality is...
Question number 2 from the audience is, is influence of the West... Okay.
You left Jay go unchallenged on 2 non-sequiturs. First of all, the Congress is not allied to any jihadi party in Kerala, and I'd like him to name this party that is allegedly allied to. Secondly, as far as the question of 370 is concerned, I actually spoke in the Lok Sabha when that debate came up, and so I know what I said. I did not say what Jay is implying that the Congress party line was. I said this is a very dangerous step because the spirit of the Constitution, which required consultation with a democratically elected legislature, has been violated by going to a governor you yourself have appointed and getting his consent in the name of the Kashmiri people. I said tomorrow that would be a very dangerous precedent for any state in India. Tomorrow they could go to your state and dissolve the assembly, and the governor could agree to some sort of central rule. The problem is that this is not what the Constitution intended very clearly. 370 was a temporary provision. It could have been removed, but it could only be removed by a particular process that would have involved the consent of the elected legislature in Kashmir, which didn't happen. That was the legislative terrorism that I accused the government of conducting, or sleight of hand, if you prefer a milder word. And I think that is the problem, and not really one of adherence or otherwise to the letter of the law. One can obviously stick to the letter of the law while undermining the spirit. That's also be settled.
This question will also be settled in the court. Question number 2 from our audience is influence of the West an obstacle to the idea of India? Dr. Tharoor.
No, I mean, frankly, ultimately, I think all democracies have to be accountable to themselves. So anything that I say against the ruling party is something that I say as an Indian citizen in a democracy entitled to criticize the government. And I expect the government to be accountable to me, and I don't particularly care what outsiders may say. So, for example, I have not ever echoed the voices from foreign countries presuming to sit in judgment upon any of our actions, whether it was 370. When I attended an international parliamentary conference, I actually said to the Pakistan delegation openly that we will fight our own battles at home. We don't need them to give us a point of view about any of our own domestic developments. And that remains my stand when some US ambassador for religious freedom echoes arguments that my party may be making. I still say it's not his business. My party can make those arguments inside India, but it's not the business of some diplomat sitting in Washington to attack my country. So as far as I'm concerned, I am not interested at all in foreign approval for its own sake, except that we as a country have sought for ourselves a role in the world. We have enjoyed a certain amount of respect and standing in the world. And it is a legitimate objective of the government to want to do things and say things and achieve things that will keep us in the good books of the rest of the world and will enhance the respect in which our country is held. To me, that's worthwhile. I think it was unfortunate that our country started boasting prematurely of being a Vishwaguru. But if one day they can be a Vishwaguru by doing things that the rest of the world admires, that would not be a bad thing at all. To that degree, yes, not foreign approval, but what we want to present to the world is relevant. But fundamentally, I want every Indian citizen to feel that the government is accountable to them, much more than to any foreign power anywhere in the world.
Would you like to respond to this question?
Yes, just a quick word. Shashi's party has indeed flirted with jihadis in his home state and has had official tie-ups with jihadi parties in West Bengal. I urge your viewers to Google it and look it up. Now, to this question, this is again a canard and a straw man argument that is thrown against us. Our viewpoint is very, very clear, that we have much to be proud of in Indian history, culture, and the way our democracy is a beacon for the rest of the world. That doesn't mean we don't have anything to learn from the rest of the world. We certainly can learn from the best examples and best practices of not only the West, but also countries in the East with also long traditions in history. Now, today, India has, I think, the most influence in the world that it has had since independence. And in a sense, it has had since many centuries ago. And it is a combination of the economic growth. We continue to be year after year for many years now the fastest growing large economy, lifting up hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It is also a continuation and the efforts that Prime Minister Modi has made to leverage our diaspora and also our soft power in a way that has not been done in many decades.
I'm sorry
Dr.
to say
Tharoor,
that.
I'm going to give you the last word.
Yes, go ahead. Well, the last word, quite simply, is that I wish that everything Jay said were true, but sadly it's not. Unlike him, because he's a busy man, I do try and dip into international media coverage of India. I do read the foreign press. I travel whenever I can and whenever COVID permits. And I must say what I hear is anything but the rosy picture that Jay has portrayed. We are unfortunately being criticized for being increasingly illiberal in our country, for having stifled in many ways the voices of dissent and disagreement. We are being accused of Islamophobia. People associated with Jay's party have burst into churches at Christmas time and destroyed property and attacked services. Minorities are seen as beleaguered. Our standing has never been lower. I would say that if you look in terms of the
Would you say that?
the great moments we've had, this is a very, very long fall that we've gone through. And the sooner the government realizes it, it is capable of course correction. What surprises me is that because they are so fond of believing their own press releases and their own propaganda, they actually think that what Jay said is true. Unfortunately, it's not true. And if they realize it, they would be able to correct themselves. Right now, they are leading India into a darkness from which we will take a long time to emerge.
Let me quickly respond.
One minute.
The foreign media that he talks about are media like the New York Times, which have become very leftist, anti-India. And they, in fact, openly advertise that when they want an India correspondent, they want an anti-Modi, anti-establishment, anti-Indian outlook person. So I don't take them seriously. I think Shashi should talk about the attitudes of the governments and the peoples, which survey after survey shows in multiple different countries, with exceptions of 2 or 3 countries like Turkey and Pakistan. Every other country, you will find the people of that country love India. They love India's growing influence. And again, I ask your viewers to search this on the net. Don't take Shashi's or my word for it. And last thing, anybody that violates the law, whether they desecrate any religious place, we condemn that, irrespective of whichever party they belong to. Just like members of Shashi's party, to prove a point, have butchered cattle on open streets to prove a point. So these are all despicable acts, and they should be condemned irrespective of party.
They should be condemned, but they haven't been condemned by the party in power or by the Prime Minister or the government or by the Home Minister. These are the problems.
I think I'm going to
and condemn it. But the Congress Party did take action against the young man who slaughtered a calf, and he was expelled from the party the same day. So action
I think
is
I'm
taken.
going to have the last word now. Whether it's Nehru or Savarkar's idea of India, but I think in the end what Nehru said, that India is an ancient palimpsest where layer after layer was inscribed with reveria and thought, and none could erase it whatsoever. So I think there is a convergence between Savarkar and Nehru somewhere. Probably the Congress Party and the BJP will find common ground in the time ahead. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you once again, Mr. Panda and Dr. Tharoor.